So I'm about to talk to you about a little open source project that I've been working on for a few months. So first of all, who here has heard of Angular? Not Angular Class now, but Angular. That's pretty good. And who here has used Angular? Cool. And who here has used it in like a project and, you know, would consider themselves an Angular developer? Oh. It's pretty good. Okay, cool. And who here has heard of Angular Class C? Oh, okay. Cool. So let's move on. So I'm just going to take you through a couple of the features. I'm not going to go through all the features. And I'm going to show you some of the things that I am looking at adding for Angular Class C 0.5, which is the next version. So first of all, I'll go through the idea behind Angular Class C. The idea is that it's a lightweight, but yet it's quite opinionated, really. But it's just a way that I have found the ideas that have worked best for me to bring structure to my Angular controllers, and it also adds a little bit of syntactic sugar to do some nice things. It's sort of popular. It's got 700 stars on GitHub, and it has been #1 on Hacker News, which makes me like a super minor internet celebrity, I guess. Okay, so I don't know, the black might be a little bit difficult to read there, but basically, so this is vanilla Angular controllers. This is how they look. So a controller is basically a function. Now you probably want to add a few more things, like if you want dependency injection, or you probably want to add it to your app module if you don't want it to be a global variable. But at its heart, an Angular controller is just a function. And then it gets instantiated by just putting ng controller equals whatever your controller name is into your HTML. So that's pretty cool. So it's simple, it's unopinionated, and it's really easy to get started. And I think that's a lot of the reason people came to Angular, first of all, because they looked at this and they were like, okay, I get it, I instantly get it. There's no cruft around it. But it does, what you'll find is that as your code gets bigger and your controller gets bigger and you try to do more complicated things, you have to invent your own ways to structure your code, and it can get pretty difficult to maintain pretty quickly. So that's what Class C is based on, or that's where it came out of. And at the end of the day, because they're just functions, it makes it really easy for us to build abstractions on top of it. So that's what Angular Class C is. Let's do that again, I think. I like that animation. Okay, so I'm going to just compare and contrast them. So on the top here, we have an Angular controller, just a vanilla Angular controller, what it would look like. So just to talk you through it, so you have app.controller, and then the first parameter you pass in is the name of the controller that maps to your HTML. So app controller is your first parameter. And then your next parameter is going to be an array. And in your array, you're passing in your dependencies. So you have your few dependencies there. And then for some reason, your last parameter of that array is a function. And that function is your controller. And in that controller, you're passing in parameters for your scope, your location, and your HTTP. And yeah, so I should point out that this is the way that you have to do it if you want to work with minifiers and you don't want to include anything else in your build process. But if you look at that, it's not expressive, and it doesn't document what you're trying to do very well. And you're going to have to look it up in the documentation. I mean this thing of having an array and the last element or the last item in an array is your function, and you're specifying your dependencies twice. It feels a bit messy to me. So the classy way of doing it is you just have an object and you pass in the name properties. So you have name, app controller, inject, and then you have whatever you want to inject. And this object-based approach, yep.
Move a bit because
oh, I'm sorry.
Completely closed out now.
Okay, is that okay, or? Yeah, okay. So the idea here is that okay for the camera too? Yeah, okay. So the idea here is that you have more of a kind of it almost documents the code as you write it, because you have this name value pair. And it's similar really to how you do things in Backbone or Ember or any of these. Like it's nothing new, but I just find that it's a lot nicer way of writing code. And you can look at that and you can kind of, I mean, just by looking at it, if you've no idea what class is, you can kind of understand what it's doing. And I would argue that maybe you couldn't do that with the Angular example. This is just a nice little picture. So what is what I'm saying. And that leads on to this slide, which is $watch. Tough crowd. So the idea here is, I pointed, this is one example of where the Angular API is a little bit, it's inconsistent, I guess. So if you want to watch a primitive, that's straightforward. You do $scope.$watch. You have the name of your primitive, and then you have your callback function that gets called whenever that primitive changes. So that's straightforward. But then if you want to watch an object, you have this strange thing which, I mean, you can look up the documentation and it'll make sense if you look up the documentation. But if you're just looking at the code, you have a true on the end and you're like, what does this do? It's not very expressive really, I guess. And then if you want to do a collection, oh, well, they've decided, okay, well, we're going to have an actual watch collection method. So it's inconsistent. And I know why they're doing this, by the way. It's because of backwards compatibility and stuff like that. So it's not like they're necessarily designing a bad API, but it's just, this is what happens when you're adding new stuff. So this is how it's done in Classy. You just have a watch object, and then you have these key value pairs. So your key is what you want to watch, and your value is the function you want to be called. And then if you want to watch a particular type of variable, like an object or a collection, then you just give it the keyword inside of little handlebars, and that's how it works. So I think it's really simple, and it's a nice way of expressing this kind of stuff. And also you can use, if you prefer, you can use deep and shallow instead of collection and object. It's just a different way of, however it fits your mental model, it will work. And reverse reference controllers. So this is a neat little feature where if you have, so this is a DOM fragment or a piece of HTML and a controller, and they're linked because you can see here we have ng-controller, footer controller, and the name is footer controller, so that kind of links the two. Classy gives you a different way of linking them, which just, it saves you a few keystrokes, and it's just a different way of thinking about it, where if you like, you can just pass the element in and give it an ID or a class or any kind of selector you like, and it will go search for that in your DOM, and it will link the controller and the piece of DOM. So what's coming in 0.5? So one of the things is computed properties, and I'm so this is this is all stuff you can do with watch as well, but I guess it's for me, and a lot of the stuff is it's just for me, and it's how I reason about things. But for me, I find computer properties an easier way to reason about how this watching of methods is done. So in this example here, I have a first name and a last name. So these are two input boxes. And then I have a div with the full name. Now, when I change either of those inputs, it's going to populate the full name. So you can see here in my JavaScript, I have full name, which is just the first name, space, and then the last name. And that automatically gets computed, and in your digest cycle, it gets updated, and it all just kind of works. And I mean, you can do this with watch, but it's going to take you a few extra lines, and I think it's a little bit less readable if you do watch example, but just to show you what it would look like, you have something like this, two inputs and then an output, and a fresh prince reference. There's also a kind of more advanced way of doing it if you want to go that route. So here we have, we've added a watch. So what we're saying here is we're watching the first name and we're watching the last name properties. Now this isn't necessary, but sometimes it's a good idea, especially if you have a complex computed property that you have to do. If you explicitly tell Angular Classy which ones to watch, then it won't. It will only compute it when those change. It won't do it on every digest cycle, which is, it can be a performance issue if you have a big complicated computed property. In this example, it would be fine, we don't need it. And we also have a setter, which is something that I don't think this is even in Ember.js, or it's not a new thing, but it doesn't seem to be out there that much. So the idea here is that it kind of does the reverse way around. So whenever I set the full name property, it's going to also set the first name and last name property. So what it does is it gets the full name, it splits it on the space character, and then it assigns the first part to the first name and the second part to the last name. So that's computed properties. And another thing coming in 0.5, and you can actually use this now if you go onto the Angular Classy GitHub repo and you go to the develop branch, it's in there already. So what this means is that you can add your own plugins or create your own plugins, or like I'll probably be the one creating my own plugins for myself, but that's fine. But the idea is that you can sort of, I guess, create your own API and go down the route you want to go to, figure out what works best for you, what kind of APIs you like. You can kind of figure out how you want to go with it. Like some ideas of plugins that I thought about. So you could have a resolve plugin. So with Angular, resolves are usually done in the routing side of things. But you could have a resolve plugin that would allow you to do it in your controller. To me, that seems a little bit more logical to have it in my controller, but it's just one way of doing it. You could also do something like mix-ins. So like when I released this, a lot of people said it's called Classy, but it doesn't really do, you can't extend controllers and stuff like that. So you could totally create a plugin to do that. Because Angular Classy is now modular. You could do events using $scope.$on. So you could, just like you have a watch object, you could have an events object, or you could even put your entire router inside of the Classy controller, which is like it would be similar to how a lot of the server-side frameworks would do this, like in Sinatra, in Flask, in Pi. A lot of them like that approach. And if you have a really minimal app, maybe it makes sense. So that's pretty much it. That's Carlton Banks. You can get it at that URL, or you can just Google Angular Classy, or you can come talk to me afterwards. Question?